I read diaries for a living, other people's diaries. And in the last 35 years, I've read over 10,000 vintage diaries. And I'm often asked, how did you ever get started doing this? Well, there was actually two reasons. The first is my father, John MacNamara. I knew very little about my father, but one thing I did know is life was full of mystery and deep heartache. He and my mother divorced when I was just a little girl, and I never really saw much of him after that, other than a few scheduled visits. But on those scheduled visits, my dad always told my sister and I just how much he loved us. Eventually, we moved away, and then when I was 13 years old, we were just told he died. His sister Sally, my namesake, was so distraught she took all his precious possessions and she placed them in a trunk, and she said, "No one will ever open this trunk." And that's when my heart broke. And then years later, painfully, I would learn that my father had taken his own life. So for 50 years, that trunk has stayed hidden. My Aunt Sally, she passed away 10 years ago, and that trunk with my father's untold stories in it, it's vanished. And so I was desperate to know more about this man who gave me life, yet he took his own life. And because of that trunk, I vowed that this will never happen again. If not in my own life, perhaps I could stop it from happening in the lives of those who have gone before me. So years later, I get married, and I have 2 children, and I am given the first diary in my collection. And it was my great-grandmother's 1931 diary. Her name was Mary Wood, and they called her Little Toot. This is her on the far left. She's the little short one, the tiny one peeking out. She writes all about sailing to Europe with the Gold Star Mothers, these group of women. These are mothers who had lost their sons during World War I, and they were sailing to Europe to pay tribute to them. My great-grandmother lost her son, William. He was stationed on board the USS Cyclops, which went down in the Bermuda Triangle in 1918, and neither the ship or the crew were ever found. So, in 1987, I began what became a lifelong mission, and that was to preserve the untold stories of others. But little did I know that this journey I was about to embark on would change my life in the most powerful way, and all because of the handwritten word. So the woman that began the Gold Star Mothers was Grace Darling Siebold. And she herself had a son during World War I that she lost. And it was then that she wrote these words: "Self-contained grief is self-destructive," which brings me to human emotions and diaries. In the 35 years I've been reading diaries from different walks of life and different generations, I've come to realize that human emotions are timeless. And I want to share with you 3 passages from 3 different diaries in my collection. So in 1792, Sir Charles Middleton, who was then an admiral in the Royal Navy, loses the love of his life, his wife, Margaret. They were teenagers when they met in the 1730s on board a ship, and they never got married until 20-plus years later because her family disapproved of the relationship. Charles and Margaret were strong abolitionists against the slave trade, and they worked very closely with one of its leaders, William Wilberforce. So, when his precious wife died, Charles picked up a blank diary, and he began to write about her death and his deep grief. This entry was written about a year after she died. Sunday, September 1st, 1793. I have felt very gloomy of late on account of the loss of my companion, my friend, my wife. O Lord, thou knowest best what is good for me. There are many places and things here that remind me daily of my loss, and I have many hours to myself to think. I am frequently low when I consider how much I am left alone by the departure of my dear companion. And at times I forget that it is by God's will. Now, fast forward to the year 1927. A young man by the name of John, a 32-year-old man living in Texas, loses the love of his life, his wife Lillian, and their baby girl, all of which happened during childbirth. John fought in World War I, and this is where he meets Lillian while in France in 1919. After the war, they get married, move back to the United States, and in 1926 is when Lillian becomes pregnant. But also in 1926 is when Lillian passes away, as does the baby. And that's when John picked up his blank journal, and he wrote all about his debilitating grief. This entry was written about 3 months or more after the two of them died. March 31st, 1927. Perhaps I should be in bed, I guess. I need some rest. I've been lost in the sea of memory again this evening in the loneliness of life. The emptiness within my heart has been urging me on to search and search for that which might heal it again. Happiness. Oh, it is indeed a word of mystery. I cannot write of things of life that bring the joy of real happiness because I am not happy. Now fast forward to the year 2008. A 51-year-old woman is living in a small Oregon town raising 4 teenagers with her husband of 14 years. He is a man she would refer to as an angel sent by God. And it's a beautiful fall sunny day. And in the distance, she hears this knock at her front door. And soon that sunny day would turn into the darkest day she has ever known, for they proceeded to tell her that her husband has been killed in a construction accident. Well, that woman was me. And in that darkness that would consume me, I picked up my blank diary. And in the span of 2 years, I would write 12 grief diaries. And those words of graces never rang so true as they did during those years of my grief. Self-contained grief is self-destructive. And so I began to write. October 27th, 2008. 2 more days and it will be a month since my incredible husband passed away into the loving arms of Jesus. I'm going to try and keep this journal so that one day I can look back on it when my heart isn't so full of pain and just see how God was with me. There's a power in the handwritten word, a power in your stories. And when you write your stories down on the pages of a blank diary, little do you know just how powerful those words can be until sometimes years and years later. 6 years ago, I had the privilege of being a very small part of getting one mother's 1944 diary back to her children. Her name was Mary Jane. And you see, in 2012, Mary Jane was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So when Bridget, her daughter, received the diary and started reading her mother's 1944 entries back to her, Mary Jane's memory came back to those events and those times written 70 years earlier. Bridget said to me, "Sally, for a brief moment in time, we had our mother back, a brief moment. And not only her memories, but her feelings too. It's truly an amazing study of yourself when you keep a diary and then you reread it years later. But I would say if you do, go easy on yourself, because as we all know, emotions are true, deep, and raw. They're just who we are, the good and the bad. And I tell you, the one of the greatest things that got me through those years of grief was reading diaries, grief diaries, from people from the past. I thought, oh, if they can make it through, I can make it through. I am not alone. You are not alone. We are not alone. 1792, 1927, 1944, 2008, and 2021. Emotions are timeless, aren't they? Now, I don't always read diaries that are just full of sorrow and grief. It's so exciting for me when I pick up a diary and I read it for the first time, I have no idea what I'm about to discover or what adventure I'm about to go on. For instance, I have 12 diaries written by a man by the name of Jerome King. They were written in the 1870s and 1880s. Jerome was a Civil War vet turned baggage master for a railway. He wrote of train wrecks and train robberies and preparing dead bodies for travel. But he also handled the luggage of some incredible people like circus performers and outlaws and prisoners, and some very famous people too, like Buffalo Bill Cody and the famous poet and playwright Oscar Wilde. And for me, it just doesn't get any better than that. Well, actually it does, because Jerome's best friend was a one-armed butcher. And this is real life. And I thought, if there ever is a movie or a novel written about him, I think it needs to be titled Jerome King, Baggage Master and the One-Armed Butcher. And then I have a diary. I can't mention his name because I don't know if he's out there right now. It's written in the 1990s. And it was written by a young man who decided to take a trip to Mexico with a bunch of his buddies. He actually took several trips while in Mexico, and that's because the group decided to take psychedelic mushrooms with them along the way. And he wrote a diary the entire time. So you can imagine what those entries are like. In fact, I want to share one of them with you. So, Skip thought I was God today, and I told him I was. And Skip says, "What say you, God?" And I said, Walter, where did that come from? Walter, you worry too much. Just have fun. Now that doesn't quite make sense, does it? But it might if you're on psychedelic mushrooms. Just saying. Well, I want to leave you with a glimpse into the almost unbelievable. You know that saying by Mark Twain, truth is stranger than fiction? Well, in the 35 years I've been reading and researching diaries, I've had several situations that have happened to me that fit perfectly with that saying, and I must share one of my favorites with you now. So, 16 years ago, I was reading a diary about a voyage to Europe that took place on July 13th, 1938. This is the day it started. It was written by a 12-year-old girl by the name of Alice Bentley. Alice wrote all about pulling out of the dock in the New York harbor and passing the Statue of Liberty and sailing on this great ship called the Normandy. Also in the diary were black and white photos that Alice had taken. She took photos of New York, photos of the ship, and then she took this one photo. This is a little gal she met, a friend she met on board. Her name is Barbara Whitting. As you can see, Barbara has her own camera around her neck and is standing on the deck of the ship. And then a couple of days later, Alice writes this, July 15th, 1938. Today we played tennis. I made friends with a girl my age. Her name is Barbara Whitting. Well, after I researched this diary, and I ended up selling it to a collector in Florida, my work went on, buying and selling diaries, and it wasn't unusual for me to get 2 to 3 diaries a week in the mail. 10 years pass, and it's the year 2015. I open up a diary, or a box, that was just delivered, and out of this box is this diary. And I started reading it. And at the top of the first page, it says, SS Normandy. And then there are several pages of autographs that they had collected. And then the diary entries start. And at the top of the diary entries is the date, July 13th, 1938. And the name Barbara Whitting. And my memory, I started going, wait a minute. Didn't I sell a diary? And I think it was about the Normandy, and I think it was written in 1938 by a young girl named Alice. I sold it years ago, but I think she mentioned a Barbara. And then I kept reading. And as Barbara wrote, she talked about pulling away from the dock in the New York harbor, passing the Statue of Liberty, and sailing on the great ship called the Normandy. So those two young girls were standing on the deck of the same ship that left the New York harbor on July 13th, 1938, not knowing each other quite yet, taking photos and writing in two separate diaries. And those two diaries ended up with me at two different moments in my life, 10 years apart. And then I kept reading. And as I turned the pages, I came to an entry Barbara wrote, July 15th, 1938. Betty and I went in swimming and played deck tennis with another girl. I also know her sister, who is 10 and the very intelligent type. The other one's name is Alice, their last name, Bentley. They are good swimmers. And then I kept reading. And as I turned the page, Barbara took a picture. Everybody, meet Alice, the author of the first diary I sold 16 years ago. I don't know if those two girls ever met each other. And it took me 2 years, but I got Alice's diary back. And by some great miracle, they're together now. You know, there is nothing like real life, your life. Our memories are good. They're not great. Our memories are partial, they're not complete. Our memories are not exact, they embellish. But diary entries written at the very moment of conception, that is real life, as real as the author sees it at that point in time. And this is the next generation of diary keepers, 2 of my 4 grandchildren, Peyton and Parker. So do I think everybody needs to keep a diary? Oh my goodness, yes. If not only to put your feelings and your thoughts from here and here and place them here, but also for the sake of history and the sake of your family. Because your life is important. Your untold story is important. And don't ever let anybody tell you that it's not, because it is. There's another saying that we've all heard that I love. Everybody has a story. But I want to add to that. Everybody has a story, and one worthy of sharing. And what better place to place that story than on the pages of a diary? Because I know of at least 10,000 people's untold stories that are worthy of telling. Thank you. Oh.